At first glance, Taiwan might seem like just another country in Asia, but there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. Alongside Hong Kong, South Korea, and Singapore, Taiwan stands tall as one of the Asian tigers, with powerful influence in both regional and global economies. Recent economic indicators predict Taiwan's GDP will grow by 3.94%, higher than last year. The latest update shows that exports in 2024 are now projected to grow by 10.06% from the previous year, up significantly from their earlier forecast of 6.14%. This follows a year-on-year drop of 9.8% in exports recorded in 2023. This remarkable turnaround from economic struggle to prosperity has earned Taiwan the nickname of the Taiwan Miracle. Yet Taiwan's situation is far from simple, especially when considering its dicey relationship with mainland China. This begs the question, is Taiwan's economic success intricately tied to its dealings with China, or has it charted its resilient course, particularly weathering recent economic crises in Asia? Back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Taiwan was facing a heap of challenges, militarily, politically, and economically. It was like everything that could go wrong did. At that time, there wasn't a lot of optimism about developing countries thriving through trade. The memory of the Great Depression and the chaos of World War II had left a strong impression. Relying on foreign markets was seen as too risky. Trade wasn't seen as an engine of growth, and the prevailing knowledge was that depending too much on trade and foreign markets was just asking for trouble. In fact, a 1959 economic survey of Asia and the Far East flat out said that most countries in the region shouldn't count on exports to fuel their development. Instead, it suggested they focus on making their own products, like consumer goods and food, to grow fast. However, Taiwan decided to go against the grain. It became the first developing economy to reject this advice and embrace an export-oriented strategy. It wasn't quite easy. In the 1950s, Taiwan faced a chronic shortage of foreign exchange, largely because its currency was overvalued. This meant there was a huge demand for foreign currency, but not enough to go around. The government tried to manage this by rationing foreign exchange, using multiple exchange rates, and imposing import surcharges. These policies severely restricted trade. Exports were less than 10% of GDP for most of the decade, and imports were only slightly higher, thanks largely to U.S. foreign aid. Then came 1958. Taiwan made a bold move that would change its economic future. The country devalued its currency to stop the overvalued exchange rate that had been suppressing exports. This change allowed the foreign exchange market to open up. Exporters could now keep or sell their earnings at a market-determined rate, ending the need for foreign exchange rationing and allowing the government to lose direct control over its allocation. These reforms caused phenomenal growth in exports and, together with improvements in the investment climate, sparked what became known as Taiwan's economic miracle, which happened in the second half of the 20th century. The economy's transformation was dramatic, moving from poverty to prosperity at an astonishing rate. However, what often gets overlooked in Taiwan's incredible success story is the full context. Taiwan wasn't just bouncing back from the devastation of World War II. It was also grappling with a sudden influx of 1.6 to 2 million refugees from mainland China, increasing its population by over 25%. This massive population spike wasn't even the primary source of tension between China and Taiwan. We'll get into that shortly. For now, let's zoom in on the immediate post-World War II period and its impact on Taiwan. After World War II, Taiwan was left in shambles. The island had endured the brutal conflict between Japan and China, followed by a civil war that wreaked further havoc. Amidst this devastation, Taiwan's economy remained heavily agrarian. Back in the Qing dynasty days, Taiwan made its mark exporting crops and natural resources. Even with Japan's push to industrialize Taiwan in the 1930s during its colonial rule, agriculture still reigned supreme. To rebuild, Taiwan first tackled the agricultural sector, which had been crippled by a tenant-based system under Japanese rule, leading to severe inequalities in land and wealth distribution. The government introduced three heavy reforms. First, in 1949, the government introduced farm rent reduction, significantly lowering the rent that tenant farmers had to pay to landlords. This was followed in 1951 by the sale of public farmlands, allowing more individuals to own and cultivate land. Finally, in 1953, the Land to the Tiller program was implemented, which redistributed land from landlords to the farmers who actually worked it. What made Taiwan's approach unique was how it implemented this policy. Instead of simply redistributing land, the government used shares of public enterprise stock to compensate landlords for their land. which they acquired through compulsory purchase. This method effectively transformed investments in land into assets that fueled industrial development. Taiwan's government also saw an opportunity in cotton textiles, an industry with potential. They didn't just dip their toes in, they dove right in to jumpstart production. Facing serious constraints in foreign exchange, the government rolled up its sleeves and embraced import substitution industrialization as its strategy of choice. But textiles weren't the only options. Utilities, fertilizer production, and even everyday consumer goods got their moment in the spotlight. The government showered them with attention, funneling resources their way to spur growth and reduce dependence on imports. These steps were necessary, laying the groundwork for Taiwan's industrialization and sparking significant economic growth. But Taiwan's challenges didn't end there. The country faced one of the heaviest defense burdens in the world, consuming 9.5% of its GNP and 47% of the government budget by 1961. From 1951 to 1965, economic assistance from the United States, totaling $1.4 billion, was instrumental in helping Taiwan achieve self-sustaining growth. This aid represented a whopping 10% of Taiwan's GNP in 1951, but fell to just over 2% of a much larger GNP by 1965. A study that explored this aid noted GNP rose greatly in the face of a fairly constant annual aid level, implying a growth in its multiplier effects through time. With the foundation laid by this external assistance and despite the heavy defense expenditures, Taiwan's economy began to transform. Manufacturing emerged as the backbone of Taiwan's economy, with small and medium-sized enterprises playing a key role. Initially, the 1950s were focused on import substitution, a strategy geared towards reducing dependency on imported goods by producing them domestically. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, Taiwan shifted to an export-oriented strategy. To accelerate economic development, Taipei, the capital city of Taiwan, introduced the 19-point program for economic and financial reform and the crucial statute for encouraging investment in 1960. These policies created incentives for investment, exports, and savings, turning foreign trade into a major driver of Taiwan's economic growth. By the 1980s, Taiwan made another strategic shift, diving into the high-technology sector. Today, Taiwan's information and communication technology industry is world-renowned. The island is home to global giants like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, ASE Technology Holding Company Limited, along with many others. This brings us to Taiwan's Industrial Revolution. Taiwan started as a traditional manufacturing hub powered by abundant cheap labor, but as political tensions brewed and foreign competitors with lower costs emerged, Taiwan faced a pressing turning point. To stay ahead in the global economic race, Taiwan changed its course towards technology. In the 1970s, the government launched the ambitious 10 major construction projects, intended to boost heavy industry and invest in local scientific and technological research. Fueling this conversion was Taiwan's rapid expansion in international trade. Just look at the numbers. In 1992, Taiwan's trade volume exceeded $180 billion, making up 82% of its GDP. Fast forward to 2012, and trade represented a whopping 140% of GDP, valued at over $650 billion. This impressive trade volume propelled Taiwan to become the world's 19th largest trader, punching well above its weight as the 28th largest economy globally. When you break down Taiwan's trade dynamics, it's clear where the focus lies. Around 99% of Taiwan's exports come from the industrial sector, with agriculture contributing a mere 1%. On the flip side, over 77% of Taiwan's imports consist of agricultural goods and raw materials, highlighting the island's limited arable land and lack of natural resources. Central to Taiwan's economic engine is its specialization in producing parts and components that merge into final products sold by global giants from Japan, the U.S., and the EU. Over 70% of Taiwan's exports are intermediate goods, a testament to its role in the global supply chain, particularly in the information and communications technology sector, also known as ICT. Speaking of ICT, Taiwan dominates here. It produces a staggering 94% of the world's motherboards and notebook PCs, with the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company leading the charge in producing computer chips used by tech titans like Qualcomm and NVIDIA. Brands like Acer and Asus have also made Taiwan synonymous with quality PCs, while companies like Quanta and Wistron serve as original design manufacturers for many global PC brands. But here's the twist. Much of Taiwan's export power isn't confined within its borders. Up to 85% of Taiwan's ICT exports, for instance, are manufactured outside Taiwan through extensive overseas production networks. This global reach is crucial for Taiwan, especially given its dynamic international relations. Taipei officially joined the World Trade Organization as its 144th member on January 1, 2002, marking a significant milestone for Taiwan's global economic integration. In terms of trade, China stands out as Taiwan's largest trading partner, accounting for a substantial 25.2% of Taiwan's total trade volume. Following closely behind is the United States, representing 12.6% of Taiwan's trade. Japan holds a significant position at 10.3%, while Hong Kong and the Republic of Korea contribute 7.8% and 6.1%, respectively, rounding out Taiwan's major trading partners. Speaking of China, let's talk about the ever-complicated and tense relationship between Taiwan and its massive neighbor. Now, Beijing insists there is only one China, with Taiwan as an integral part of it. The Chinese government considers the People's Republic of China the only legitimate government of China, a stance known as the One China Principle, and its ultimate goal is the unification of Taiwan with the mainland. A key element in this complex relationship is the so-called 1992 Consensus. This agreement was reportedly reached between the Chinese Communist Party and Taiwan's Kuomintang Party. However, what this consensus entails is a matter of debate. For the PRC, the 1992 Consensus represents an understanding that the two sides of the strait belong to one China and would work together to seek national reunification, as Chinese President Xi Jinping stated. Meanwhile, the KMT interprets it as one China different interpretations, with the Republic of China being the one China. So you can see how the same phrase can mean considerably different things depending on who you ask. Now, let's talk about the economic relationship between these two. Up until a few years ago, Taiwan and China had a sort of symbiotic trade relationship. Taiwanese companies, which we've established as some of the world's largest makers of electronic components, relied on China's cheap labor. In return, China craved Taiwan's technical know-how. It was a win-win situation until it wasn't. As China began to develop its capabilities in petrochemicals, steel, computers, and digital displays, it started muscling in on markets once dominated by Taiwan. Taiwanese firms operating in China found themselves increasingly sourcing materials and machinery from local Chinese suppliers. And now China is even making strides into semiconductors, Taiwan's last big industrial stronghold. This growing competition isn't just about rivalry from China. Taiwan's economic strength lies in producing parts for computers and mobile phones, but global markets for these products are getting saturated. Without a new tech boom like wearables or 3D printers, the future of Taiwan's hardware industry looks challenging. For Taiwan, an export-led economy, staying relevant in global trade is important. However, this is where geopolitics throws a wrench in the works. Taiwan faces significant geopolitical ostracism. What do we mean by this? Well, without China's approval, other countries are reluctant to engage in free trade talks with Taiwan. Meanwhile, Taiwan's main competitors, Japan, South Korea, and China, are busy signing trade deals left and right. You might think the easiest solution would be for Taiwan to deepen its trade ties with China. But politically, that's a non-starter. In 2014, Taiwanese students even occupied the parliament in protest against a services trade deal with China. The protesters stormed into the chamber, fired up about how the trade deal with China could spell trouble for Taiwan's economy and make it more vulnerable to pressure from Beijing. They were particularly concerned about the implications of the agreement, which would open up opportunities for both sides to invest more freely in each other's services markets. This act of resistance emphasizes the political sensitivities and the fear of becoming too economically dependent on the mainland. In contrast, the United States and Taiwan may not have official diplomatic ties, but they've got a solid unofficial relationship. Think of it as a strategic friendship where the U.S. sells Taiwan advanced defense gear to beef up its military. But as you might expect, this doesn't sit well with Beijing. China has been quite vocal, repeatedly urging Washington to stop the arms sales and to cut off any official contact with Taipei. At the center of this tension is the U.S. One China policy. This policy, guiding U.S. actions since the 1970s, is based on several key documents, including the U.S.-China communiques from 1972, 1978, and 1982, the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, and the 6 assurances from President Reagan in 1982. These documents set out principles like rejecting any use of force to settle the Taiwan issue and maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship got even cozier, much to Beijing's annoyance. Trump greenlighted more than $18 billion in arms sales to Taiwan and opened a $250 million complex for the de facto U.S. embassy in Taipei. Trump even took the unprecedented step of speaking directly with Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen before his inauguration, the highest level of contact between the two sides since 1979. This phone call was a break from decades of diplomatic practice. Then, in 2022, things got really interesting. U.S. Speaker Nancy Pelosi decided to visit Taiwan, which led to an explosive response from China. In retaliation, Beijing conducted military exercises around Taiwan. A show of force meant to signal its displeasure and to remind everyone of its claims over the island. For the U.S., it's a tightrope walk of maintaining regional stability while backing Taiwan's security interests. Before we get into the last part of the video, make sure to check out the link in the description for our best recommendation when it comes to further expanding our knowledge on a more personal scale. So, back to our burning question. Is Taiwan's economic success closely tied to its relationship with China? The answer lies somewhere in between. Taiwan's economic success isn't entirely dependent on China, although China does play a significant role. Over the past few years, Taiwan has managed to navigate the choppy waters of the COVID-19 pandemic and the political and military threats from Beijing, thanks largely to its crucial position in the global electronics supply chain. The Taiwanese semiconductor industry in particular has been a powerhouse, exporting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of chips to China annually. This strength has helped Taiwan mitigate the impacts of China's economic coercion, reducing them to mere annoyances rather than crippling blows. However, those expecting Taiwan's trade to skyrocket this year might need to temper their optimism. The economies of Taiwan's largest trading partners, the U.S., China, Japan, and Europe, are all projected to experience slower growth in 2024 compared to 2023. For instance, the U.S. GDP is expected to slow to 1.8% from 2.4%, with imports and exports growing at a modest 1.1%. China's GDP is projected to grow by 4.6%, but this might be an overestimate given the current economic challenges China faces. Japan's GDP growth is expected to be just 0.9% and Europe's around 1.2%. Even the more optimistic estimates from the World Trade Organization suggest only modest growth in global demand, with North America's imports expected to grow by 2.2%, Asia by 5.5%, and Europe by 1.6%. Now fast forward to recent times, Taiwan's economic progress is evident. In 2022, Taiwan had a GDP per capita of $32,679, a substantial increase from $22,012 just a decade earlier. This is a stark contrast to the average GDP per capita for the Asia-Pacific region, which was $8,369. These figures, while positive, aren't quite enough to bring Taiwan back to its pre-pandemic levels of trade. Looking at the other main drivers of Taiwan's economy, investment and consumption, there are some promising signs for 2024. A survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan revealed that 92% of companies plan to maintain or increase their investments in Taiwan this year. On the consumption side, activities like increased tourism are expected to give a boost. Worldwide tourism is anticipated to return to pre-pandemic levels. In Taiwan, which saw tourism numbers in 2023 at about 50% of pre-pandemic figures, has plenty of room for growth. Thanks for hanging out today. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to stay tuned for more fascinating insights into the world of economics. If you're curious about exploring different economic landscapes around the globe, check out the video on your screen. It's packed with interesting details you won't want to miss.